Please give a Value Studio welcome to the one, the only, Brook Manville.
Well, thank you, Thornton. You know, one of the reasons it's always so nice to reconnect with people like Thornton is you just feel instantly good just coming up on the stage. So he did his job. I actually think I first met Thornton at a knowledge management conference back in the 90s, which is, how I misspent some of my youth. And, I was kind of on the edge of technology in those days. I was not, hardcore technologist, nor am I today, you should all know. But I was struck listening to Curtis's remarks yesterday, which were terrific, and the discussion we had. How many of those contemporary questions that he teed up have really been around in some form or another for a while? And I think back to the 90s, and the solutions are different, but some of those questions, like how do you hold on to really distinctive talent? How do you get to scale? What does partnership mean in a fast-changing competitive climate? The decentralization and user empowerment and all that. I mean, those are sort of evergreen questions. The answers are different today, and when I look back on the 90s, I kind of think, as my daughters would say, "Oh my God, it was much less complicated then." But we have new complications today, and we have to deal with them in different ways. But I think the questions remain. And to Thornton's point, one of the questions that I think is an evergreen question, and has certainly been around for much longer than going back to the 90s, is this question of judgment. And I was delighted that Curtis's remarks in our conversation yesterday touched on that so many times, because in fact, at the end of the day, particularly if you're in a technology role, as most of you are providing information, you are providing tools, you are providing the means to improve the decision-making and indeed the judgment of your organization and of your colleagues and your customers. So I want to talk about judgment today, and to add a little bit of levity, I called this presentation "Your Brain on Decision Making," or Why Your Organization is Smarter Than You. And I'll explain the title in a minute. Let's see here. There we go. So the featured story is the book, which is on your table, or was on your table yesterday. This is a book I wrote with Tom Davenport, who is probably much better known to most of you in the IT world. He's written widely. Tom and I are friends for 25 years. We've worked on knowledge management. We've worked on related issues of technology and decision-making together. And we were having lunch together with another friend, who many of you probably know, Larry Prusak, and we were starting to kick around this whole idea about decision-making and judgment. And we came up with the proposition that, in fact, judgment is something that is too often affiliated with an individual when we talk about it, but in fact, in today's world, and we'll get into this in a minute, judgment is in many cases more distributed throughout an organization. And we wanted to try to put our arms around what that concept was. So today I want to give you the Cliff Note version of the book. If you read it on your Kindle or read it on your iPad, you'll enjoy it, I hope. But if you don't, and you remember a few headlines from today, I will have done my job. So we'll get into some of the main themes in a minute. Quick tour of today's discussion, where the bus is going to stop. We're going to talk a little bit about big decisions, your brain, and then good judgment and organizational judgment, this concept of organizational judgment, which is at the core of the book. I'll give you a quick summary of the approach we took and some of the key findings, and then we'll finish up with a few questions to think about, both here at our tables, and we'll do a Jim Cramer lightning round and do some discussion. And then hopefully this will stimulate you to bring some of these ideas back home to your own organization and continue the conversation with your colleagues. Let me start with a story. The book is organized around stories. This is actually chronicled in greater depth in the first chapter of the second chapter of the book. It's a story about NASA and a launch that they made in February 2009. Actually, it was March 2009, but the problem first arose in February. And this was one of the not famous launches of NASA because there was no huge disaster. And that's, in fact, the story of the story. But, let's kind of ground ourselves in what a big decision is. And this was one of those tough decisions. Curtis mentioned yesterday the double-decker bus with the kid on the top with maybe a boombox and maybe an RPG. And how do you make that decision? There are big decisions in all of our lives. This was a very big decision for the engineers and the program leaders at NASA in February of that year. So about 3 months before, the other shuttle, the Endeavour, had made a safe flight and had landed, and in the post-flight examination, which is what they always do, they discovered that a small valve in one of the fuel systems had malfunctioned and was not opening the way it should have. And because of various backup systems, it didn't cause a problem, but if it had, rocket fuel would have sprayed all across the ignition area, and it would have been perhaps another Challenger-style disaster. So you've got the shuttle landing, everybody's safe, it's no longer part of the news cycle, and lo and behold, the engineers find that one of these small valves had, in fact, malfunctioned, but in fact, to no great harm. So the next question is, we're going to launch another one in a couple of months. Is there any chance that this is going to be a problem that will blow up the plane, will blow up the shuttle? And so they started an agonizing series of analyses and examinations, and they ran a series of tests on the metal within the system, and they came back and they announced that we have reasonable confidence that this valve is not going to malfunction. So plans proceeded, and they were moving towards launch. And then one of the engineers went back and looked at the data from the test, and he swallowed hard and raised his hand and said to his supervisor, "You know what? The test was flawed. We've discovered that there were some wrong instruments used, and we can't verify 100% that this valve will not fail." So by now, the spacecraft is on the pad. The highly regular processes are moving into position. Everybody's getting ready, and the decision is, do we go ahead? We don't have the data that we thought we needed to be sure. The part is no longer made, so you can't go to the manufacturer. It was now an obsolete part that they were using. And the question is, essentially, do we stop the music and tear apart the shuttle and figure out what to do, or do we somehow try to hedge the risk? And, a huge cloud comes over the program control. There is a pressure to make these things go off on time. It costs millions of dollars every day that the clock ticks. The engineers are well respected and are very good at finding reasons not to do something, and you want to listen to them. So there's a kind of a tension between the program people who, let's get this baby launched, and you have the engineers saying, well, I'm not so sure. And you've got the cloud, as I mentioned, hanging over everybody of the Challenger and then later the Columbia disaster, and who wants to be part of another one of those? So a really hard decision based on a very small piece of machinery that cost about $11. So the decision in the big in the issue here is, who will make the call? How are we, and what's the process we're going to use to make that decision? How are we going to do that? This is a fundamental big decision, right? We'll come back to it in a minute. So in all of our lives, if we read, newspapers, watch the news and whatnot, we are well acquainted with, big decisions. And typically we confront in the news, the decisions that failed, the things that went wrong. the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the decision to let Lehman Brothers fail, which many people believe actually started the great financial meltdown in 2008. The decisions or non-decisions that happened in the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf. And BP is, of course, continuing to litigate all that in court even today. Whatever your politics, I think it's pretty clear that there were not weapons of mass destruction, despite the earnest advancement of the thesis that there were by Colin Powell in the UN, which then, of course, led to the Iraq War. There are many, many bad mergers that have been made through time. I think one of the more bad ones that people still talk about is the AOL Time Warner, which destroyed millions of dollars of shareholder equity. Lots of bad decisions, lots of big decisions that went wrong. But I want to stress that in writing the book, and also as you think about this, you all live with really big decisions. They may not be famous, they may not be of the magnitude of financial meltdown for the global economy, but you have some really tough calls to make, and I understand that, you understand that. Whether it's the launch of a new product, New Coke is one example that's now part of history. Restructuring an organization and pulling that off. A decision whether or not to outsource or create a partnership across national boundaries. Or to roll out a new application, maybe an ERP system. Who's ever done that? Right, lots of you. So, these are big decisions. They're not necessarily famous decisions, but they have many of the same elements. Lots riding on it, and the same NASA question sits on your desk or the desk of your boss or the desk of your colleagues. How are we going to make the call? What's the process we're going to go through to get there? So one of the things that adds some adrenaline to all this today is that I argue, and we argue in the book, that the stakes for making the right call are actually increasingly high in today's global economy. And so I showed this presentation a few weeks ago, and somebody said, "Is that the Play Club in Columbia?" No, that is not. It is merely intended to say, you're rolling the dice. You're rolling the dice. The stakes are high. So why is there higher risk and higher reward in today's world? We live in an era of hyper competition. There are more people looking to steal share from you, steal ideas from you, steal talent from you. On the positive side, the scale of opportunity is much greater. I mean, if you can pull off some of these big decisions about mergers or about new products, it can lead to, millions of new revenue or huge market share gains. So there's a lot on the upside as well. The speed of information and reputation, of course, this is well known to all of you, what 10 bad comments in Facebook can do and circulate the globe within minutes about your brand, your company. And of course, global capital and customer markets rapidly punish bad decisions. If you watch what's going on to the rate on Spanish bonds in Europe or things like that. And of course, there's also, this has been noted by others, the broadening range of stakeholders. There are more people who have a point of view about how a decision needs to be made, what it means for them, the social dimension, the value chain partners. Lots of people are now involved and have their fingers in big decisions, perhaps in a way that was not before the case, or at least the linkage is that much tighter. So there are big stakes. There's a lot riding when you really have to face down one of these tough decisions. Well, cognitive scientists have done path-breaking work in the last 10 years. The whole revolution of cognitive science and just looking into how the brain works and understanding the brain has changed so much of what we understand about how humans actually operate, and of course it has lots of implications for management. So, we all remember, from the 70s and the 80s, this is your brain on drugs, right? And then, of course, on a somewhat happier note, there's been lots of interesting brain research done about what happens when you're in love. And so, your brain on love lights up in different ways, and that's fun to listen to and think about. But so let's talk about now your brain on decision making. What actually happens when you make decisions? And there have been a number of books recently that have been written about this. There's one on the bestseller list right now, which I recommend, by Dr. Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Lots of books are coming out and saying, you know what, we understand more and more how the brain functions when it makes decisions. And if you don't have time to read all the new books, I have, one quick summary. It's bad. It makes mistakes all the time. And the fancy, you read one of these books and you wonder how you're ever going to get out of bed the next morning because you're probably going to blow it, But on a more scientific note, there are, an increasing number of what have been identified and called cognitive traps. And this is about 5 or 6 of them. There are literally lists now of 100, 200 different ways that you can misjudge and make a bad call. Just some of the classic ones that you hear about. One is called anchoring. Anybody know what anchoring is? Anchoring is when, if you test people and you sort of mention all these different numbers to them, and then you ask them to make a decision on a price or something, and lo and behold, they end up using some of the same numbers they were just talking about. Your brain kind of gets fixed on, it must be $1 million. Well, let's bid $1 million, right? Outcome bias. This, very familiar to you. Somebody comes into a meeting thinking he or she knows the answer, and lo and behold, that tends to end up being the answer. This is an outcome bias. The gambler's fallacy, if anybody's ever suffered this in a bar, 7 straight flips of the coin leading to heads does not mean the 8th time is more likely to come up heads, although all human nature would suggest, yeah, it should. There's clearly a streak here. The bias of small numbers. Bias of small numbers, again, is, you start to see 3 or 4 repetitions of a phenomenon, and lo and behold, it's a pattern. And you suddenly universalize this. I just met 3 women who are left-handed. All women must be left-handed, right? Zero risk avoidance. You get burned in a bad decision and you swing the pendulum all the way the other direction. Oh my God, we better not make any deal with anybody because look what happened last time. So these are all human aspects, and there's brain chemistry that now can be looked at to actually go along with these things. And one of the other pieces of jargon that people use, these are called heuristics. We need shortcuts. We need heuristics in order to cut through the data and to move ahead. We don't have time to look at 7,000 instances, so we do tend to make pattern recognition based on a few cases and move on. We had an interesting discussion yesterday that in today's fast-moving world, we don't have the time to do the lengthy analysis that we would ideally like to do. Perfectly normal to watch a streak and wonder, will the next one also be an instance of the same case? So these heuristics are shortcuts that we need in order to move ahead and to get out of bed and to keep moving, but they all have their problems and their dangers. And the big headline is, so what are we going to do about that? How do you kind of move ahead and make shortcuts, but not fall into the trap? So let's start with just a quick picture of the topic at hand, judgment. What is good judgment? So if you say, well, look, I need to get good judgment, I understand the traps, let's agree what good judgment is. So if you go back to the last slide, well, it's lessening the influence of all these cognitive traps. That's kind of a fancy way of saying it. Good judgment is not making all those mistakes. Well, that's probably not very useful. So let's put it in a more positive light and say, it's the quality of making decisions that optimize opportunity with appropriate risk. Risk is not going to go away, but you've got to grab opportunity. How do you find the right level of risk to take advantage of the opportunity at hand? and that it's going to be in some way or other disciplined and fact-based. We don't want personal agendas. We all know that as soon as a personal agenda comes into the room, the chance of making the right call goes almost to zero. And there's also something about flexibility, that good judgment are decisions that are informed by continuous learning, that you have to be willing to change direction when the facts teach you the errors of your way. Right? So being stubborn and saying we've always done it this way, or we once made a good decision, let's just make the same decision for the next 13 years is obviously not going to be wise. There's a flexibility that has to be built into it. So there's some version of judgment that's better than not, that has these kinds of qualities, or this is what we would just offer as a starting point. So the question is for you as leaders or as managers, so how do you get this good judgment? So what do I need to do? Well, if you read any of these proliferating number of books, the answer is, be aware of it and retrain yourself. Be aware of all these cognitive traps. Don't fall into the gambler's fallacy. Don't draw conclusions based on your ego. Make sure that you obey the law of large numbers and not small numbers, and so on and so forth. And those are good things to do. There's no reason to ignore that, and reading these kinds of books about all the cognitive traps, all the heuristics is helpful. But there's another way which in many ways is more pragmatic and is really at the heart of our book, which is change the game and redefine what decision-making leadership means. So if there's one sentence about the book, it's that we want you to start thinking about judgment not as yours, but the judgment of your organization, and indeed even more broadly your networks, your partners, and whatnot. And so you need to move to a world where your judgment is actually drawing from the benefit of many other folks. Okay? Now again, that may sound easy, but it's amazing how often that doesn't happen in organizations, and we want to talk a little bit about why. So part of this is about redefining leadership. Again, we had with Curtis yesterday a very interesting conversation about leadership. What is leadership? Some of those qualities. When we get to the question of decision making, our proposition to you all is that we need to kind of move away from the sort of the great man or great woman theory, the kind of the lonely and heroic leadership model. We've got a tough call, but Joe's going to make it because Joe never gets it wrong. Or we got a really tough call, but Sally's steering us the right way, and we're just going to follow. And it's tough being Sally, but that's what you get for being CEO, or that's what you get for being CIO, right? And it's heroic, and it's lonely, and it's kind of the knight on the white charger, right? We want to say is, particularly in today's world, with all that's going on and all the kinds of changes that you all know very well, we really need to think about kind of the broader ecosystem of wisdom. How do we tap into all the sources of knowledge and understanding? How do we get not from the lonely decision maker, but more to a world of organizational judgment? And if we can do this, your brain on decision making has some help. Your organization helps you, right? And again, this is something you probably know, but it's amazing how often and how difficult it is for people to get to that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the approach of the book was so-called appreciative inquiry, and it was case-driven. Instead of focusing, as many books on decision-making, on the individual, we said, kind of as a hypothesis, we have a hunch that, in fact, many great decisions come about as a result of an organization working together. We hypothesize that, and let's go see if we can actually find some stories. It was based on some stories Tom and I had been doing work with many organizations, and we just felt this was beginning to be part of the reality of business today. Let's actually start to document some of these. And then we also said, instead of, like most decision-making books, looking at the catastrophes, the BP horizon, the Iraq War decision, the Lehman Brothers, New Coke. Let's actually look at some angels as opposed to some devils. Let's actually look at some decisions that worked out well. Let's be much more prescriptive about what we should do as opposed to what you should not do, which is what most of the decision-making books for managers end up being. So out of the research, we ended up tracking down and detailing 12 stories, 12 big decisions, and we had 4 major themes. We were not looking to create, a sort of a single all-dancing, all-singing framework from the get-go. We wanted to be very much case-based. We said, let's look at some big decisions, real decisions made by real people, not kind of the stuff of necessarily of history books or for the ages, but let's actually look at how some real people struggled with the decision. Let's have enough of a historical look back that it actually worked out, so we know it was a good decision. And then let's essentially reverse engineer. How did the good decision get made? What were the elements of the good decision? And out of that kind of story-based, case-based investigation, we came up with 4 major themes. I'm going to take you through them, and I'm going to warn you that the order of the themes here is a little different than it's in the book. I think it's more lends to a conversation like this, but this is essentially drawn from the different chapters in the book. Probably the most important is when you look at the leaders, it's not all about the leader. It's not all about you. The very first and most important thing, I would argue, that we found in these cases is there was leadership, and when I say leadership, I'm usually meaning a single person, but not even always, that basically said, you know what, I actually don't know everything that's needed to make this decision. I myself am not wise enough, strong enough, or powerful enough to actually make this call alone. And you might sit here and say, well, duh, yeah, I mean, okay. But again, in the workplace, how many of you have works with somebody who doesn't always think this way? Anybody? Again, leaders often define themselves as the decision maker. That's my job description. Why am I here? I'm here to make decisions. Well, there is a place for leadership, but what we're saying is, let's think about leadership as somebody who actually embraces a wider circle of inputs than just his or her own brain and experience. And that was the case in so many of the stories that we developed. Just a couple of quick ones from the book. We looked at a New York-based foundation, one of the biggest foundations in the United States, called the Wallace Foundation, and they were struggling with how to focus their strategy so they could make much greater impact. They had been giving grants in all different fields. They hadn't really seen anything other than just a little bit of change here and there. They said, let's really focus. And their board said, I want you, CEO, a lady named Christine DeVita, to figure out how to have much more impact in a smaller number of fields. So one of the fields that they picked was educational reform. And they said, okay, now what are we going to, what are we going to focus on? There's going to be teachers, computers in the classroom, whatever. The process that they went through, instead of just leaping to an answer, was let's actually change the organization so that all the people, and there were many, many people in the Wallace Foundation who are working in different parts of educational reform, start to work together in a much more coherent and collaborative way. Let's blow up the silos, because it was a very siloed organization, very hierarchical, and let's actually, reconfigure how we work together and problem solve so that we can actually maximize what's going on in the market, what's going on in the industry, and what's going on in all of our heads, and get to a better answer there. And it was a cultural change process. They developed a way of thinking that they called being hard on facts and soft on people. But, and what they finally came up with was that there was this was in the late 1990s, there was an underappreciated part of educational reform, which was helping school principals to grow and succeed as managers, because so much of the work up until then had been actually helping teachers in the classroom or computers in the classroom. So this was a big aha. It came about as this process, and it actually changed the whole way that educational reform has been done ever since. But it all began with the CEO saying, I'm not going to make this call. We're going to collectively make this call, and we're going to change how we work in order to pull this off. Media General is a newspaper and television station company based in Richmond, Virginia. Like many newspaper companies, they were struggling with the digital revolution, and they were completely organized around what they called platforms. You know, there was a web division, there was a newspaper division, there was a TV division. It was all organized around the technology, or the platform, if you like. And they went through a process of how are we going to get on top of the digital revolution? And the answer that came out at the end of the process was we're going to actually converge around customers as opposed to platforms. Again, that was the essence of the strategy. But again, once again here, the key part of the story was it began with the CEO saying, you know what, this is a complicated question. It's going to cause a lot of collateral damage in this organization if we don't do this right. I'm actually not smart enough to do this alone. I actually need your help. This is a southern, genteel company, very hierarchical, very polite, but everybody knows their place. And on one morning, he astonished his direct reports with a memo that said, this is coming, we've got to change, and I want to start working with all of you in a very different way. And he went through a personal transformation. He empowered all sorts of people who never had permission to even raise their hand before. He put in place, social media, and he basically transformed the company and particularly his top management team into a problem-solving unit that eventually changed their strategy and changed the organization. But again, began with his own personal transformation, his acknowledgement, this is not all about me anymore. Tweezerman is a beauty products tool. Any women here use Tweezerman products? Anybody? Yeah. Founded by an entrepreneur who had launched many, many companies. Most of them had failed. He had made always just enough money to start the next one. And he himself, I interviewed him, his name is Dal Lamanga, he had an epiphany when he started this company. He said, you know what? I now understand that we will never grow this company and get to scale unless I embrace the knowledge and the understanding of the people who are working with me. And I have to change. I have to stop being this failed, brilliant entrepreneur who is always going to have one more idea that's going to make it. And he built a team, and they created an operating style so that when they faced a very big decision, which was how do we go from serving one sort of big customer to going national and rolling our products out through a major drugstore chain, which had lots of risks and lots of costs. How do we do that? He called on all the people who actually had to do the implementation, and they worked together, and it ended up being a multi-million-dollar bonanza for all of them, and several of them retired multimillionaires. But again, it started with the CEO who said, I've got to change. Okay, another theme that we saw, which again probably will be familiar to many of you, is that in every case, and particularly in some, there was some kind of a disciplined, participatory problem-solving process. So that it wasn't just kind of accidental, or you came in one morning and saying, let's do it this way, or let's send off the rocket because I'm tired of waiting. There was some kind of a process that had some basic principles, like big decisions are actually about many smaller decisions. Let's break down our big decisions into smaller decisions. Let's actually encourage diversity and dissent. Let's actually not be annoyed by people who disagree with us. Let's actually be glad that somebody's disagreeing so that we can get the other side of the case. Let's be transparent. Let's be fact-based. Let's be deliberative. Let's involve experts, implementers, and stakeholders. Let's actually talk to the people who need to implement whatever decision we're going to come up with. Let's be explicit and sequenced in how we go about this. So there was some kind of a process. It wasn't always completely extended and huge, but it was not accidental. And we saw this in many of in most of our cases. So the NASA story that I began with, the launch decision. What they did is they constructed which is now part of their operating culture, a new approach to what they call the launch readiness review. And they brought together in one large theater all of the engineers and all of the program people, and it was facilitated through a process of iterative problem solving where they would surface a particular issue about this part, they would understand what questions needed to be answered, they would then go away, they would online have forums and discussions, they would come back together, they would share their findings, they would debate it, diversity was encouraged and dissent in the discussion, they would identify new questions, they would go away, they would come back, and the leader in this case, a man named Mike Reichkovich, was a master facilitator. I mean, his role as a leader was to facilitate that the best knowledge and that the best arguments were coming forward and that there was an increasing level of certainty about the decision to launch. And in the final day of judgment, they literally had the astronauts who were going up on the flight sitting in the bottom of this circular theater, and they had the last vote. Are you guys convinced of what you heard that we are ready to launch? And they had the deciding vote. Now, talk about involving your stakeholders, right? And they said, we are ready, and of course, there was indeed a happy ending. The launch went off, and gratefully, Shuttle 119 did not become part of history in the negative way. We looked at the company where I worked for many years. McKinsey & Company made a dramatic and very controversial move in the end of the 1980s about hiring talent. They had built a premium reputation on getting sort of best and brightest MBAs from Harvard and all the top MBA schools, but they were running out of MBAs and they were growing very quickly. And the question was, what are we going to do? We compete on the basis of distinctive talent. What are we going to do? And they looked at sort of other MBA programs. Could we somehow get more from other programs? And then somebody had the idea, let's actually just hire really smart people. Let's actually go hire engineers. Let's hire doctors. Let's hire people who have PhDs in literature who are pretty smart and seem like they might know something about business. This was hugely controversial. But the way they got to this is they put together a team and they investigated lots of different options, and then they actually went to all the different offices across McKinsey and said to the hiring and the staffing managers, if we did this, would you actually put these people on projects? And what would it take? And the answer was, well, if they perform well, I guess we'd do it fine. And so then they went back and they said, well, let's design the personnel system so that there is a real fair evaluation of these people up against the MBAs. And let's let the fact-based decisions that come out of how they're performing decide whether we go ahead with this. So over time, they put in place metrics, they put in place problem-solving sessions, and lo and behold, they started to realize that this was going to work. There were certain kind of non-MBAs who did better than others, so they focused on that, and over time it got more and more institutionalized. But again, it was not just a decision made by the managing director, it was driven down into the organization and pursued through a series of, again, fact-based and deliberative discussions and trial and error over time until it became institutionalized. So when I interviewed the managing director, he said, Brook, there was actually no magic moment. This decision emerged. The reason it had to emerge is because it was so complicated and there were so many moving parts, we had to involve all the people who were actually the stakeholders, and they were the ones who helped us decide. So again, a case of organizational judgment where not the managing director, but the organization itself came up with the answer. WGB Homes is a home builder outside of Boston. Their business model is essentially built around what we would call organizational judgment. They had, like many home builders in the last couple of years, huge problems selling homes, and they developed this strategy of doing what they call late configuration design. They design sort of the shell of a home, and then they spend huge amounts of time and effort talking to buyers, talking to customers, seeing what other competitors do, and then they make the inside of the home and the configuration inside to suit exactly what people are looking for and price it accordingly. So again, it's not just design it this way and see if anybody will buy it, but rather start it, and then let's use the organization, let's use the value chain, let's even use the customers to help design the product, and lo and behold, people love it because they've had a hand in building their own dream home. So again, the business strategy based upon the judgment of the collective that's actually built into how they make and sell their homes. Okay, the third theme is one that is so much better known to all of you than me that I feel embarrassed even talking about it, but it was certainly something we saw again and again. That the great decisions we studied almost always had some dimension of analytics, technologies, the use of networks embedded in the process, right? So again, it's off in the corner for IT to worry about, don't burden me with this, but rather embedded actually in the life and work of the organization. Partners Healthcare, well-known healthcare company outside Boston, has been a pioneer in moving patient records, clinical data, and also human juried knowledge that's embedded in tools into the whole patient delivery process. And so they are, again, reducing drug incidents, patient improvement statistics and whatnot into the actual decision-making process between doctor and patient, and have shown massive improvements in all sorts of metrics against patient well-being. School systems, one of the advances, I would argue, of the Obama administration is they have been adamant about pushing the value of data and analytics in education. And one of the school systems that we studied in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system, again, a pioneer in actually creating analytical tools and analytical approaches to looking student by student how they were learning, what kind of questions they were missing, what they needed to do to raise their scores, and then tailoring curriculum and tailoring teacher intervention around the data, and have shown huge gains in addressing the so-called achievement gap. Minority students are advancing much faster than in other school systems thanks to this intervention. And Cognizant, one of our sponsors at this program, again, you probably know Cognizant, has been a pioneer in using knowledge management and analytical tools integrated into the process of how they actually work to serve customers and also to improve the knowledge and effectiveness of their own people. So the last theme is in many ways the hardest to talk about because it's the most intangible, but it's also arguably as, if not more important than the other ones. It's the cultural context. And I show you here a picture of the iceberg, the culture, the value, the behaviors, the mindsets that lurk below the water, right? The unseen part of what drives an organization, the culture. Somebody once described culture as the way we do business around here. It's just something you have to learn by being here. Well, the theme is that these organizations that are best practices that we're holding up to you also tended to have some kind of cultural underpinning, some kind of cultural context that basically allowed the kind of thinking, the kind of dissent, the kind of problem solving that we talked about to happen naturally. It was not this special event. We're all going to work together to make this decision, then go back to operating like rats in the maze. It's just kind of part of how we work, right? EMC, which is the storage company up in Massachusetts, had a very interesting experience, which actually is the beginning of a cultural transformation. The transformation is our theme in these 2 days. This is a transformative study. They, like many other businesses in 2008, were struggling because of the economic downturn. The CEO wanted to make some deep cuts in order to stay competitive. He was fearing layoffs, and